Good morning, and welcome to this panel discussion on transitioning to the cloud, sponsored by Bluware. My name's Ram Shenoy, and I'll be moderating the webinar. In the last 5 to 10 years, digital transformation and the migration to the cloud have been a major direction for the energy industry. We're very fortunate to have a panel of experts who are playing leadership roles in the ongoing transition of business operations to the cloud in one of the most challenging data and compute intensive domains: seismic data acquisition, seismic data management, and processing for oil and gas exploration and development. They'll offer their perspective on the ongoing transition, challenges faced, and offer insights to the audience on how the oil and gas industry can embrace the potential of the cloud while navigating the challenges using open standards such as the Open Subsurface Data Universe or OSDU platform, and commercial solutions such as Bluware's interactive AI deep learning. Let's introduce our three panelists briefly and what they do. Our three panelists are James Moran, Vice President of dataWorx, Innovation and Engineering at BP. James is the Global Head of Data Management, Engineering, Analytics, and Science in BP's Innovation and Engineering Group, including production operations, refining, HSE, and business services. Sverre Brandsberg-Dahl is Partner, Chief Technology Officer, and Azure Global Energy at Microsoft. Sverre leads Microsoft's efforts in leveraging the latest technical innovations in cloud computing and AI across the oil and gas industry. And finally, Dan Piette is CEO of Bluware. Dan previously served in leadership positions at a number of institutions such as Petroleum Geoservices, TerraSpark Geosciences, and others, which were devoted to delivering new technology to the oil and gas industry and which have been successfully sold to oilfield services and software companies. Now, we'll learn a bit more about each panelist and their background as we go through the discussion, but let me just explain a little bit about the logistics of today's webinar. We'll have roughly 35 to 40 minutes of moderated Q&A, where I'll pose questions that I've previewed with each of our panelists in advance. At the end of the 40 minutes, we'll have roughly 15 minutes of audience Q&A. And for the audience Q&A, you're welcome to pose a question at any time in the chat window, which is the message or chat emoji icon in your menu panel in Teams. And just pose it in, and I'll do my best as we're conversing with the panelists to incorporate that into the discussion. Otherwise, I'll endeavor to get them to them at the very end. And with that preamble, why don't we get started with our very first question? So, and I'll ask James. James, BP made a major announcement last year on its reimagining energy strategy. And, when you and I talked, you essentially said, BP can be thought of as two companies. One is the core oil and gas business, which is using the tools of digital transformation to generate the profitable returns that will fund the second business, which is the energy business of the future, creating new business models around data as an asset. So I'll come to the business of the future in a minute, but right. Why don't we start with you telling us about how BP is digitally transforming its existing business? Can you give us one or two examples of how digital transformation has changed your oil and gas activities, perhaps around subsurface and your subsurface digital strategy, for example?
Yeah, sure. And firstly, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, I can give you a few examples. We've been on this journey for quite a long time, particularly the subsurface and well space. It's always been a digital space in reality. I think the last few years, though, have seen this ramp up based on changes in technologies that we've been able to take advantage of. So I'll give you a few examples maybe of, particularly over the last few years, where we've put a lot of investment and time and effort, and we've seen a lot of value coming out. So one is we took a hard look at how we were deploying technology across the company, particularly subsurface and wells technology. 20 years of investment into, or longer, into many of the tools we use to model the earth, plan wells, etc. But the technology we're using, workstations, local data centers, there's quite a heavy overhead there, and upkeep and time to improve those systems is really high. We developed an Azure-based system with virtual machines and a global pool of these machines to manage this system and provide access to anybody from anywhere effectively. This has become particularly useful during the pandemic as everybody suddenly moved home. We couldn't cart the workstations with us in any case. So, and we also witnessed hurricane season. So from an operational perspective, having this type of environment has been good. It also allows us to share data more rapidly within a cloud-like environment. But it is a lift and shift, and we'll maybe come on to some of the changes in architecture further into this conversation. Another space maybe of the last 5 years has been in big data. We're probably on about the 5th generation of data lake, to use a very broad term. We've seen a lot of benefit to moving from on-premise to cloud again with that system. We've seen a lot of benefit within that for real-time streaming and the ability to pull a lot of data from around the world, production data, for example, pull that together, optimize different systems, different topside systems around the world. This has been particularly effective for us at BP. And maybe the last one is something that we're doing more recently, which is pooling, I guess, our knowledge of operational events from around the world, particularly when we're drilling wells or planning new wells. We are centralizing a lot of this type of activity in BP at the moment. So what we've been worried about is losing knowledge and access to knowledge from experts around the world and then being able to share data rapidly. So we've been building cloud-based systems to allow us to mine some of this information, co-visualize that information together, such as well drilling events, and layer on top of that, I guess, the early phases of some machine learning that we've been developing around that. So kind of move to the cloud and digital activities for slightly different reasons across BP in the last few years.
Excellent. That's actually a very rich answer with lots of threads to explore. Maybe let me ask Dan to pick up on this. Dan, you've been in the industry for a long time, in the oil services industry, looking at the application of IT. And can you just tell us a little bit, as you've observed over the last 10 to 20 years, how you've seen the cloud enabling the reconfiguration of subsurface activities and how Bluware has participated in that transformation?
Certainly. Thank you. And thanks, Ram, for being the moderator here. I think we're very lucky to have you. Bluware, of course, has been around for quite a while. And so Bluware ourselves has been through some transitions in the last year, in the last 2 or 3 years especially. We've been extremely fortunate to have some fantastic partners such as BP, and the other one is Shell, our 2 biggest partners that I can talk about because we both have press releases out about them. And what we've done is taken technology that we developed over the past 20 years, realized that it's applicable in 2 different ways. One is in the cloud and one is in machine learning. And so by starting off with VDS, which was an object store database that was developed for our own internal use, we realized that it's perfectly set up to go into an Azure instance or into an on-prem if necessary. But it also set up to perfectly feed data into a machine learning, deep learning process. Really what we need in order to capitalize on that then is the standards that we've been talking about and that you asked about. And yes, I've been involved way back in a company called OpenSpirit, which was operating as a middleware layer between different databases and different applications. But it was sort of a poor man's cloud, I guess I would call it, where people were coming in and saying, yes, if we have all our data here, we can transform it as it's feeding into Landmark or feeding into Schlumberger. The cloud is a much more powerful example of how that can work, where now you put all your data into a standards-based database in the cloud, And now the applications go to the data instead of the data going to the applications, which means that if you want to have a wavelet extraction routine, you can extract the wavelets. If you want to have an artificial intelligence, you can use that. If you want to have a new inversion program, you can do that too on the cloud without having to move the data back and forth. So we've seen that evolution. And when you ask what's the different now is we're starting to see the true value of what some people call adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility, where people can come in with different applications. It doesn't have to be ours to access that data. I mean, BP might choose Schlumberger to do part of their work, and they might choose us to do part of the other. As long as the standards are in place and the data's in the cloud, it makes that very, very simple.
Thank you, Dan. I think your remark on standards is something that I'll follow up with you on in due course. But let me maybe go to Sverre, because you know, over your career, you've bridged both the oil and gas industry and the software industry, having started out as a geophysicist and then, you know, culminating in your current role at Microsoft. With that perspective, would you care to build on James's comments on how Microsoft works with partners to offer the cloud as a tool to transform their operations?
Yes, I'm happy to, and thanks again for inviting me to be part of this panel here today. I think how James framed it is sort of the conundrum that we face as an industry. I think we are working very hard at Microsoft to be in both of those main drives for a company like BP to be relevant. I think Dan Piette said it's very easy to get this interoperability. I think that in my mind that is the sort of the crux that we are facing here as partners in this journey, because we need to tie together well-established, very complex workflows that have a legacy, that have specialized systems, that have specialized data, they have enormous amounts of data with sort of call it, you know, promise of easy operations in the cloud. And I think we have, as I said, worked hard with our customers and our partners at Microsoft to be the trusted partners in both of these spaces and really enable that transformation. And I think that where you're seeing us play a role here is not at the sharp end of the drill bit per se, but you know, there is a big domain here around security, identity, how you can safely operate in these you know, in these new environments. I think that we are doing our utmost to be relevant up and down that whole stack. But you know, sort of looking back at what I've done in my career, I think really this sort of enablement of these very advanced workflows that we, you know, not say we took them for granted, but the oil and gas industry did major groundbreaking work in the seismic space, I think in the data space as well. And there is a catch-up there for the clouds to really be able to manage it, and linking that with the operations, with the, you know, sustaining and improving the capabilities of companies to work. And again, well, Bluware and this VDS example in my mind, I hope we can come back to that. That's the key. That this is the sort of the enablement that we need. And you know, it's not us that is inventing those things. That there's a need for smaller innovative companies, big companies. This is a complex industry. It's a global industry, and many aspects to consider in that sense.
Thank you. So Dan, I'd like to pick up on your remark on standards and maybe ask you to elaborate. Sure. You know, you've participated in several industry efforts, as you alluded to, on open standards, and you know, what I want to talk about is the OSDU data platform. Would you agree that the oil and gas industry has generally been hesitant to implement open standards? And what do you think is different this time? And perhaps illustrate it with maybe elaborating on with OSDU and why things are different this time and why it will be more fruitful for all stakeholders.
Yeah, I think you're being kind. I think that the industry perhaps has almost been hostile to standards to some degree when we see it. Going back to POSC and even before POSC, when people were starting to say it just makes so much sense. But at the same time, this is when computers were first being introduced. So in order to defend the oilfield service companies that were coming in this, they said, I can make it better, I can make it faster, I can make it more efficient to use just my stuff. And so you saw that over and over again. I worked for Landmark Graphics, and Landmark made it very clear. We had OpenWorks, and it was the best database ever, and why would we ever want to change it? And then Schlumberger came in, and we said, we have the Petrel and the Ocean data store, and Ocean is so much better, and why would we ever want to change it? And so it was really hard to get people to come in and say, we can make it better. And partly because Landmark was primarily on a workstation-based product. Petrel was primarily a PC-based product. So they had different platforms on which they were operating. And so it behooved them to make sure that their performance was as optimal as possible. Now, with the implementation of the cloud, and I remember when we first started talking about the cloud, it was probably 10 years ago, and I had meetings with some of the really big oil companies, and they said flat out, we will never put our data in the cloud. We're worried about security, we're worried about cost, we're worried about all this stuff. Well, thanks to things like Moore's Law, computing in the cloud has become maybe not cheap, but a lot cheaper than it used to be. Storage in the cloud is a lot cheaper than it used to be. And as people move it there, then they start to see the synergistic effects of kind of what I talked about earlier. Now you can have a bunch of different pieces of software operating on that same data. The adversarial interoperability that I like to talk about so much, just because it's kind of fun to say, but it gives you the opportunity to have a real small company. There's a company we're working with right now that is coming up with some new ways to do processing, which are brilliant and fast and all this, and we think that that's gonna solve some problems. That wouldn't have been possible if you didn't have a system in place like Azure in the cloud where the data is all operating there. The other thing is the scalability. I mean, you can open up nodes. You can say, oh my gosh, I need to have 100 nodes operating on this right now, so I get it done in 1% of the time. Depending on the goals of the oil company, they can work with the cloud provider. I'm pointing in this direction because that's where these guys are sitting on my screen, in order to come up with that solution. And I think that the oilfield service companies are looking at this and saying, yes, this is better. Now I don't have to compete on data structure. I can compete on the application itself. And there's going to be a transition. Believe me, moving from an on-prem solution to a cloud solution isn't going to happen overnight. But you see the big guys doing it. You see the small guys taking advantage of it. So honestly, the scariest words in the English language are, it's different this time. But I think it's different this time. I think that that OSDU, which is well thought out, well attended, seems to be embraced by the oil companies, is going to give us a solution there.
Oh, okay. So let me follow up with that, maybe with James to follow on, which is maybe if you could give your perspective, because BP has had a significant investment in its own proprietary seismic computing. You've just heard Dan talk about how oil and gas companies now begin to embrace the cloud compared with 10 years ago. Perhaps speak to that, and maybe also your view on open standards and OSDU, and how the interplay between the cloud and open standards seems to be, if I understand Dan correctly, making a virtuous cycle where it's actually getting buy-in from the different stakeholders. How do you view it from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think Dan used the word competition. I think the oil companies are recognizing the maybe we're changing our view of where to compete. Standards always took a long time to embed because of the marketplace that was providing us with the software and our ability to thrive for distinction in every bit of the workflow. I think as we've got more and more mature in certain parts of the workflow and subsurface and wells, there's less need to compete in some of these places. The serendipity of cloud maturing, our business model starting to change and quite rapidly in the last couple of years, is meaning that we're less likely to compete with each other on things like how we store our data or the compute, with a couple of maybe exceptions to this, which I'll come on to. But so OSDU is, we jumped straight into it because we felt like there was enough weight behind this. We would get away from standards as shelfware to standards as actual software that we could do something with and implement, alongside an architecture we were all recognizing we were moving to in any case. So we're not going to compete in the same way in that space. It's not going to make us as distinctive. What we do with the data is what's going to make us distinctive. I think in BP, where we're still seeing distinctiveness in infrastructure, is maybe HPC. I think we've got a challenge for Sverre and Microsoft there, because it's not just compute nodes themselves. We actually have a whole culture around the programming capability that sits in our HPC. It's the combination of the people, the infrastructure, and the way we pay for it. It kind of allows for experimentation. If you pay for a fixed capacity every year and you say, go for your life, you can run it hot all the time, the scientists in the company are like, great, we'll just keep running stuff, right? There's no limit there. What always tends to make people a little worried is the pay-as-you-go, ever-expanding model. Now, I know there are different models within the cloud for us to allow for this, but so for us to move away from that, where we've had a lot of success, and we're not the only ones, I think that high-end computing may change over time, but that's the one place where we have some maybe distinctive capability that's also tied to the infrastructure. Now, that group as well are nothing if not pragmatic, so they're willing to take on new standards. In fact, I think seismic imaging providers has used standards for many, many years. I think what's changing, OSDU might help this, open standards through OSDU such as VDS, which has come out of Bluware, that might allow us to make a bridge between cloud and on-prem heavy compute. It might allow us to bridge our workflows into the interpretation space more effectively as well. So I think the standards that are being developed in OSDU could underpin a lot of what we're doing in terms of our transformation. But we're not, we're not entirely cloud pure in this one part of our business. So there's a challenge there for Sverre and team, I think.
Yes, very good. Just a note before I ask Sverre to respond to that, just a note to our audience to please, if you've got questions, put them in the chat and we'll do our best to try and address them in the flow of the conversation. But Sverre, maybe I could ask you to sort of respond to James's comments, and maybe also if I could just ask you to comment on, Microsoft must be tremendously experienced with open standards across many other industries outside oil and gas. So maybe you could also build in your answer what Microsoft is doing to encourage the oil and gas industry to tap into the value of open standards, and maybe give us an example of, how do you see it play out in other verticals, for instance?
Yep. No, I'm happy to. I think let's start with the open standards, and I'm going to, just pile on to what both Dan and James have said, that the OSDU initiative, I think it is sort of, it's the right thing for the industry, right place, right time. You heard about these kind of sayings, and we were also right out of the gates there to support that initiative. And I think the industry is hopefully seeing what can be achieved when large sort of cloud providers like ourselves and our peers have been in there developing and sort of building out a standard that is there for everyone to use. I think that is very much linked with how Microsoft behaves. And I also, working for Microsoft, that I acknowledge that, this is also a company that had the same type of, proprietary data formats and vertical integration in a former life in that sense. I think that the cloud has also changed the computing business to a very big extent, and I think now everyone should double down on these initiatives and drive towards it, because what we always say is that the big difference is between data standards. Make them be open, make them be so that people can have transparency on that and their data is mobile, but that is very well linked to data ownership. And I think James mentioned early on that the new business of BP is focusing on what they can do with their data. And I think that's where we have also taken very firm stance and saying that our customers' data is truly our customers' data. And that is also sort of a, I think, distinction compared to many other cloud operating models in that sense. But in that space, an open standard is the foundation, if you see what I'm saying. When it comes to HPC, so that's another sort of, it's a good challenge. And I love the topic of HPC and have always sort of been deeply involved in it. I think, go maybe a little bit philosophical now and make an analogy and say that for this industry, we are all looking to sort of tap into the promise of AI and ML. And I think that it was maybe over promising for 10 years ago, that's when we started the cloud journey. I mean, it's going to solve all problems. And I always said, you meet executives, and back in the days when we could fly, my statement was that they all read sort of the Wings of the World magazine on the airplane. The cloud is infinite, it's free, and AI ML will do the work of everyone in your company. But I think we've sort of been grounded back in truth now that there's a need for humans, there's a need to move faster, and there's a need to get mundane tasks automated. And where I see HPC, and I think the example I want to bring people's attention to is sort of the Open AI initiative. There's two of those. There's one that is an oil and gas related one, but there's one around generalized AI models. And that also requires HPC. And I am sort of advocating convergence here to say that, should we now think about an oil and gas HPC computer? I've been living in that world, and we have world-leading machines, but there is now this wave of, call it generalized HPC, that is needed. And I think it's a little bit the same with the data standards and coding standards, how the software stack looks, to maybe look for those kind of convergence, because then you will have access to infrastructure that is in the cloud, and I think as performant as what you could build yourself today. But I think this is a challenge for all of us in this industry to look into and see how we can sort of be smart, reuse solutions, and get the economy of scale that way.
Thanks, Sverre. I see a question in the chat, which I'll come to in a minute, but because you mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning, actually, let me maybe pick on that thread, because Dan, you mentioned it earlier. Yeah. Dan, maybe I ask you to elaborate on your comments on artificial intelligence and machine learning and how it's transforming business and energy industry, as you've seen it over the last 10 years or so. And perhaps illustrate that by how Bluware is incorporating it into its offering.
Sure. Artificial intelligence, very broadly speaking, is just the computer doing something that people can do. If we would look back at the auto pickers that were invented in the late 80s and early 90s, I think at the time we probably called those artificial intelligence, because they took data and they applied a filter to it and they came up with an answer. And you see a lot of those things that are still being used today. But given the new availability of a lot of compute power and given the availability of a lot of data, we're seeing a transition. And there was a change in the way AI has been used. I think it was about 5 years ago, if I remember my conversations with Paul 5, 7, 8 years ago, where the people that are working on the deep learning, and let's be a little bit clear, so artificial intelligence is a very broad scope, which is all the different things that computers can do that people could conceivably do. Machine learning is a little bit narrower, where the machine actually learns from what it's done, and then deep learning is even narrower than that, where it takes a very specific path to solving a problem. I like to call it matrix multiplication. But what we do here is we say, I'm going to come in now, rather than say, go out and pick a horizon, I'm going to go into a seismic line, for example, and I'm going to say, I want to look at this stratigraphic package. And it looks like this in this part of the seismic data. It looks like this over here. So I have a person going in there and identifying that. The computer will then go and take that information, and through a series of mathematical manipulations, it will find everything else in that data set that looks like those labels. So you're labeling, and then you're applying that label to a bigger group. Again, I have to say we've been very, very fortunate to be working with companies like BP and Shell as they're exploring how these tools are being used and coming up with amazing results. One of our clients sent us a note and said, and she works in the Gulf of Mexico, and she said what used to take her 3 months to get done in this interpretation now takes her 3 hours. And that's the sort of improvement that we like to see in these sorts of implementations. If you come in and tell me you can do a 10% better job than a zone daughter picker, I'd say, why change? You know, there's no incremental advantage. But when you come up with orders of magnitude better, and we're starting to see that not just on our side, because we're focusing on seismic, and you can see it on the well interpretation, you can see it with people that are doing production optimization, because these new tools are available. And again, by analogy, you have the standards, so everybody's looking at the same data. You have the clouds, so the data is all in one spot. You have the expandability. You can increase the number of nodes that these processes are going to be run on, and that's how you then start coming up with answers. It's a pretty impressive increase in performance that we're seeing using machine learning where we didn't before.
Thank you, Dan. And I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but actually, before I clear those, James, maybe I'd ask you to follow up, because I'd just like you to talk about BP's experience more broadly with AI, machine learning, deep learning, the family of technologies. And are you seeing similar types of impact across a range of oil and gas activities? Would you care to comment?
Yeah, we are. I mean, we all read the same in-flight magazines that Sverre was reading 10 years ago, and we've been disappointed ever since. I think we've there are a range of areas where we've seen some successes. I think the success is somewhat predicated on we kind of need a whole stack approach to this problem. If you just bolt in some AI algorithm into an existing application or an existing system, we tend not to see such great results, right? We kind of need the algorithm or the machine learning model to live and breathe in an ecosystem that's set up for it, like expandable nodes or access to compute in the right fashion and the data piped in the right way. So I think we're doing some work there generally across BP in our cloud platforms and actually on-prem a little bit as well. But generally within the Azure space about setting this up properly. So that's one comment generally. I think in terms of some examples, the subsurface space showed a lot of promise 5 years ago. I think, to Dan's point, is starting to look promising now. I caught up with a few of the geophysicists in the group very recently, and they are seeing promising results from technologies that were maybe at SPE type conferences or EAG a few years ago as research, and now we're being able to use and seeing some benefits from. Things like when we apply it to our facilities, anomaly detection in equipment, being able to pick out patterns that just humans cannot do from the sheer volume of data and provide warning signals. That type of approach has been pretty successful. And the other place, I guess, we're starting to use it more and more is knowledge mining. So we have treasure troves of dark data sitting there, decades of decisions that have been made in places that are really hard to do anything with. Targeted or surgical incision into that with knowledge mining algorithms, and you need to be quite targeted in what you're looking for. But that type of approach from things like NLP, OCR, building models off of that, taking schematics for plants and turning those into real data that we can marry up with our real-time systems. That's where we're seeing a sudden uptick in kind of machine learning activity that's noticeably changing the way we think about how we're going to deliver a digital solution, actually, beyond maybe what we did before.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So let me begin clearing some of these questions. I think this first one I'm going to direct to Sverre, because I know Microsoft thought quite a bit about it. So this first question is about security, and the question is asking about how the panel can comment on individual country data regulations and location of data in the cloud. Microsoft's thought quite a bit about sovereignty and so on in how it works with customers. Could you sort of tell us about that?
Yeah, I'll make an attempt. I think if we start with the security piece, I think that's a domain where AI/ML plays a prominent role today, because there are great data pipelines. So to sort of just again say that the BDS has in my mind unlocked this data pipeline issue in multidimensional data. I think back to Dan and James's questions, that's where you're now seeing it with data pipelines. It was time series data, whatnot. Security are manageable pipelines, and that is one of the key technologies that we are using and anyone else operating in the cloud. And I would say security is paramount, and I can also see the question on the screen here as I sort of jump ahead to that number 3 around reliability, because I think security reliability is very much linked, and we are always being reminded that Microsoft runs on trust, so it is at the center of everything that we do. And I think what you can tap into as a user is the notion that it is the most important thing that we do. Our ability to invest in it is quite substantial. And we are here to make our customers, partners run on this platform. So that's why I thought of this is the day job of the majority of our cloud company, I would say, sort of the reliability and the security of this platform. Are there risks in this space? That there are always risks, but I think sort of leading into data and how we operate, I think we are working in most countries. We're working with lots of entities that are highly regulated, that have very stringent requirements. And I think that what we like to call platform learnings is something that we're always sort of taking out of all of those interactions and bringing it down into the core offering, so that is going to become more robust by the day. And the other thing I think is quite important with the cloud, which is sort of, it's the dynamic nature of the cloud, because the cloud is, you talk about how you can develop software and how you can leverage for your business. That is dynamic. It's an infinitely, or it's like a continuously spinning loop, but that also happens inside. So in terms of security and patches and stuff, I think the time to mitigation is also a lot shorter. It might not be a point that you sort of see, but if you imagine a poorly connected box with an operating system that is very out of date, that can be a vulnerable point. We have things that are being updated on a continuous basis with all of these signals, with all the telemetry that we're getting from all our operations globally. So that gives myself, and I think lots of people, confidence that we are out there running at the lead of this race, and putting the customers' ownership of their data, access to the data, and security of that data as the number 1 priority in everything that we do.
Very good. James, I would imagine BP spends a lot of time thinking about business continuity and security. Would you care to comment on that question?
We do. And it's Cyber Week this week in many companies, right? So we're thinking about it a lot right now. But I noticed that Gert has put in some questions about things like sovereignty as well, and where the data exists. And so the cloud has opened up the ability to transmit anything to anywhere, but it's meant that we have had to really think about how we control that. And it's actually allowed us to put in some regulations in a form of code that we were very hard to do in the physical space before, to stop individuals moving data around geographically. So we still need to think about physical data. We need to think about raw data. We need to think about the interpreted products coming off that data, and different countries and geographies have different rules around all these things. So we're trying to, we are baking that into the security models that we have around the world, and where we apply, where we put our data into the cloud and access different cloud services. This is a constant evolution as the cloud itself gets better in terms of its ability to see into this space as well. I think one of the areas we're working with Microsoft on is that cataloging visibility of our estate. It can't quite keep up with the volumes of data we're pumping in, and we've also got a lot more business education to be done around the ownership and the responsibilities of labeling things correctly and tagging things, so that the new technologies we can have can keep better track of stuff, keep the lineage on our data more effectively. So it's high on our list of things we consider need to be done and looked after, but I think there's a continuous learning opportunity here for both cloud companies and major organizations.
Thank you. And Dan, maybe if I could ask you to comment on how you work with customers across, because your customers are global, and how you navigate these challenges in Bluware.
Yeah, because we're not managing the cloud, we don't see the security issues that the people at Microsoft have to address. And so for us, it's more, we're more bound by time zone issues, right? We have people here in Houston, we have people in Oslo. And so we have the Western Hemisphere covered pretty well in terms of time zones. But in terms of being able to get the data back and forth, we support whatever implementations the cloud providers have offered. We don't have a way around that. We have to live with that.
Yeah, so very good. So let me maybe stay with you and turn to this other question in the chat about, which is maybe going, you spoke to this a little bit, which the questioner is really asking about the complexity of more and more products and applications, and how they're asking, does that mean oil and gas companies move away from proprietary software development? Does that mean you got a unmanageable mass of multiple applications, and how do people navigate that? Maybe I think I heard you already talk about adversarial competition wins best, but maybe I'd ask you to build on that right here.
Sure, I love this question from Paul, and I think that it really kind of goes to the heart of the benefit of what I'm talking about in terms of the adversarial interoperability, the cloud, and to some degree the AI. So the question is, in case everybody didn't see it, is will OSDU and these standards encourage or discourage oil companies, end users, from building their own products? In my mind, I think every oil company has some amount of what they might consider their crown jewels. They do something differently, sort of to James's point really early on. They do something differently that competes better than any other oil company. It might be on the processing side. It might be a process around interpretation. It might be a machine learning network. It might be something like that. I believe that with the cloud and OSDU, it gives those companies the ability to just write that piece that's their competitive advantage. So now they don't have to build an entire interpretation system around it. If everybody's using the same data, and if everybody's using OSDU, all of a sudden their wavelet extraction routine, which might be the best in the world, can be used to extract those wavelets and then use them in the processing, or use them however they're using it going forward. And so I think this encourages the oil companies to create products that are best for their users. If they design these well, and if they use good programming techniques, they should just slot right into the cloud and the environment that exists there. It should be transparent. I mean, you should be able to use that wavelet extraction at the same time you're using Petrel, or the same time you're using your processing software. To me, that's one of the most exciting things you can see here, is that even if you're a small company, you might have something that you believe is better than anybody else, and now you can implement it without having to worry about doing everything else around it.
Thank you. So we're sort of well into the Q&A part of the discussion. I do have a few more questions, but I just remind the audience to put in your questions into the chat box, and we certainly have, I think, time to address them. James, I'd like to come back to something you said in your very first answer, which is we talked about BP's existing business and the business of the future, creating business models around data as an asset. Tell us a bit more about that, and what is that transformation, and how you see these digital technologies enabling that transformation.
Yeah, okay. I think, Ram, actually, I'll just add to Dan's comments on, because it ties into what I'm about to say about transitioning a company as well. We like the OSDU because it should create a marketplace. It's that marketplace of innovation we're really after. I think we don't want stagnation in this environment, and we want big, small, ISVs to come and create new stuff that we can use. Dan is absolutely correct. We will create distinctive capability where we feel we need to. I think, again, the standards part of it allows us to do that faster, hopefully, in theory, than we've done before, from simple Python-based models where we can pull an API to get the data in a way that we couldn't do that in the past. The challenge will be interoperability and making sure that OSDU allows for that effectively, so our workflows that cut across this marketplace of suppliers works as effectively as it would if we just got it from one monolithic organization. So that's something that we need to make sure persists with the OSDU model. And that's really important for us on the transition, to answer the question that you just asked, Ram, because we've got this, we call it Reimagine BP, the transition to a lower carbon business model. And data is going to be at the heart of this, we believe, not least because the market for renewables is quite different from the commodity-based market that we've been living in for like 110 years or something. So we need to be more flexible, more adaptable. And our business model is to supply integrated energy products to different parts of the world. So, in the next 10 years, certain geographies will be better served by wind than solar, and a mix of gas in there as well, potentially. To be able to deliver that, we actually need to integrate these systems so that it's a pretty simple and easy to absorb delivery of energy for a city or a company or an individual. And behind the scenes, we need to integrate our digital environments to be able to do that. We need to be able to do it so that we can rapidly build new business models on top of this as well. So we can start to predict where we might get fluctuations in the demand coming through, weather pattern changes, right? We need to be quite hot on all kinds of stuff to deliver this model. So BP going through this transition, and other companies are as well. We're going to rely heavily on this interoperability and integration capability and the ability to mine our data effectively.
Very good. And maybe, Sverre, I could ask you to follow up with James on that, because the other part of when you and I were talking, you were talking about not only Microsoft's extensive global footprint, but also about using the cloud to create an industry literate operating system, was, I think, the phrase you used. Tell us a little bit more about that. I don't think you were meaning to be pejorative or anything like that, but more the advantage of doing more, maybe building in sustainability into it. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and you touched on my favorite phrase there. So you have both Dan and my favorite phrases out in this webinar. But I think it's the term that we sort of coined in conjunction with OSDU. I think OSDU started as a subsurface piece. I think we looked at this broader and said, okay, how can we make the cloud be an operating system for a company like BP? So they need to then run their existing business. They need to connect it with the subsurface. They have operations. They have productivity, meetings, email, all of these things needing to be tied together. And I think it's just like it's the evolution that is happening in the cloud space, because an operating system was there initially to make a computer do some useful stuff. Now, for cloud to be useful, it needs to also have certain basic capabilities, and we are in Azure working very hard to sort of build out those domain capabilities connected in with what other capabilities we have and other offerings we have across Microsoft. And I think, sort of the security piece, Microsoft 365 for me shows a lot of good analogies for people if you look at sort of what we call the office graph, but sort of what connects the data across a bunch of different applications. That is kind of, maybe a picture of what we're looking to do here to support the business. And it is, look for inspiration and challenge us on those kind of things. What you also, when we talked about, was the whole sort of how the energy transition is happening. I think that is also centric to what we do. And we've said one thing is to help, sustain these companies and make them more efficient. And we're doing all of this with a view to also help bring down carbon emissions. And I think, open up any paper today, you can see that emissions is three quarters of the greenhouse gas emissions related to energy production. We are doing our utmost to be in here, be relevant, and produce this type of operating system then for people to go and address that system. We can't just do this and say use solar and wind. We're going to have to engage and help drive that transformation. And I think while we're still building this thing, and OSDU is a very important piece of it, that's where this term sort of operating system, industry literate operating system was coined. So I hope that sort of gets a little bit to the point. It is a huge topic. Happy to come back and talk about that. If I can add one comment though to this interoperability and OSDU thing, I think is linked to the question that Gerhard put in the chat as well around security, because I think that across there is the data access, and there's also the notion of having non-adversarial things happen to your data, because the industry has been very good at controlling data, control access to data. Think of a tight well and exploration. I mean, these things have been perfected over years, how all of this works. I think that never underestimate the challenge around that to get to this marketplace vision is what I'm saying, because that there is many aspects from data licensing and access, sovereign items here, etc. This notion of sort of always encrypted, as we like to call it inside Microsoft, is there on the horizon as a way to maybe address it. But I think this is a topic that needs all of us to sort of work together and address it, so we can build sort of the right kind of capabilities then, so that someone like BP can smoothly operate while leveraging technology from Bluware and other innovative players that are out there in the cloud.
Thank you, Sverre. As we're coming up to the final minutes, maybe Dan, I could ask you to, as a final question, sort of build on James's. So James, as a customer, talked about the two businesses, the core oil and gas business that Bluware works with BP on, and also this notion that the businesses of the future will be built around innovative business models around data as an asset, which he's described as something that the energy industry is really just coming to take advantage of and move towards. What does that imply for Bluware and how it works for customers going forward? Just talk a little bit about how, with maybe building on the themes of interoperability and standards, that enables Bluware to, in its directions, to help customers with their future solutions as they transform, as James is describing.
Sure, and it's a good question, probably a good question to end this on, because we're all transitioning. I mean, I think it's naive to think that we don't have to address the carbon issue. And so that means we have to see how we can use what we know to help get us in that direction. What we know is data. What we know is machine learning. What we know is labeling. And all these things have a use far beyond just oil and gas. So we have started some exploratory work. I think a lot of the people on the call, and certainly the people in the panel, know some of our technology people like Paul, Andreessen, Marius, and the folks that have come up with these really clever ways to address issues in oil and gas. We'd like to believe we can come up with really clever ways to address issues in other areas as well. For example, with where are you going to put wind farms? Where are you going to put solar farms? How are you going to address production issues around those side? Those require massive amounts of data. I knew a guy who was interning with Shell, and he told me the amount of data that was generated by each wind turbine every second, and it's megabytes, gigabytes of data. All that data right now is sort of being thrown away, right? I mean, they're trying to keep it, but there's so much data they're not. You can see an environment where you take that data, capture the relevant parts of it, whether it's sort of the differential parts where things are changing, going to James' point about maintenance and where things are going to have to be fixed, or how do we optimize it in a given wind situation. We deal with a lot of data. We address tons of data, so we see how we can help move in that direction, get that data into the cloud, get those data into a machine learning environment. We also see it can be a tremendous help to transition from when you're saying, I want to drill fewer wells. You can drill fewer wells if you have a better idea of exactly what's going on. You can drill fewer wells if the optimization works better. All those things are addressed by data, and we'd like to believe that we have a handle on a lot of those pieces of data that can then go off into a new machine learning, a new deep learning environment that helps companies like BP come up and make those decisions going forward, takes advantage of Azure and the cloud from companies like Microsoft.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, let me just maybe take a minute or two to recap what I think our panelists sort of conveyed in this rather rich conversation over the hour. So James started with the point that oil and gas companies such as BP are really running two different businesses and creating the business of the future while using digital transformation to improve the profitable execution of the current business. The themes of cloud and open standards and the interplay with them to have interoperability to lower cost of execution came out very strongly from all three of our panelists. Amidst all of that, Dan and James talked about the benefits of that interoperability to innovate in applications of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and what that impact on the business that's already having now. Sverre talked about the concerns of this, more open infrastructure on security and reliability and how that can be managed. And all of them have really, I think, closed with the discussion on the businesses of the future being more firmly geared around data as an asset, and how the cloud and open standards and technology such as AI really begin to enable that for the future. Now, thank you to the audience for listening to this webinar. Thanks to all the panelists for giving us the benefit of your insights. This webinar was sponsored by Bluware. It is being recorded and it will be published on the Bluware website shortly, and they'll be pushing it out on social media. And with that, thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks, Ram.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.